Good evening and welcome. Thank you for joining us for the second of 3 spring lectures of the 2025 Society of Architectural Historians St. Louis Chapter, St. Louis Public Library Steedman Architectural Library Lecture Series. On behalf of the St. Louis Public Library Steedman Architectural Library, we are pleased to continue our collaboration with the Society of Architectural Historians St. Louis Chapter and host this lecture series. Before we begin, we ask that you all please mute your devices. Should you be joining us remotely and have any questions, please type them into the comment section. After our talk tonight, we will pose your questions and those from our audience to tonight's speaker, Noah Mowers. And now I'd like to introduce John C. Gunther, FAIA Lead AP, an architect who serves as president of the Society of Architectural Historians St. Louis Chapter. He'll introduce our speaker for this evening's talk. John?
Thank you, Trent, for your welcome and for hosting this talk. Please know how appreciative we are to the St. Louis Public Library, Steedman Architectural Library, for our continued collaboration for our Architecture Around the World lecture series. It is my privilege to introduce our friend and colleague and tonight's speaker, Noah Mowers. He is a designer with Mackey Mitchell Architects. Working in the field of architectural design since 19, Noah Mowers is a recent graduate from the Sam Fox School of Art and Design at Washington University in St. Louis, and a new addition to the storied local firm, Mackey Mitchell Architects. Following a professional and academic career working in a variety of fields, in recent years, Noah has begun researching the development of building codes through the lens of contemporary economic and social conditions. His thesis, Codifying Domesticity, synthesizes the characters and cultural conditions involved in the development of the U.S.'s first residential code. Noah's current work is in continuing his research on this subject, which he believes has multiple avenues for research. In addition to this, Noah is working at Mackey Mitchell on the new Metrolink Green Line project for the Bi-State Development Agency. Tonight, Noah will talk about codifying domesticity, the story of the recommended minimum requirements for small dwelling construction of 1923, the housing policy of the Hoover Secretariat, and the impact on American residential architecture. During the 19th and 20th centuries, fire disasters and health safety issues led to the widespread adoption of building codes. While the National Board of Fire Underwriters published the National Building Code in 1905, the code did not maintain regulatory consistency across the nation. This lack of consistency across the nation and socioeconomic factors contributed to a nationwide housing shortage of 1 million units by 1919. During World War I, the government addressed the housing crisis through the United States Housing Corporation and Emergency Fleet Corporation, building public housing based on the ideals of the Garden City movement. Following the war, these corporations were shut down, but the housing crisis persisted. In 1923, under Secretary of Commerce Herbert Hoover, the Department of Commerce released the recommended minimum standard requirements of small dwelling construction, BH1, to standardize and economize single-family housing construction nationwide. In addition to this, the government encouraged and popularized the lifestyle of single-family living through the Better Homes of America Association. Linking these two directly is the involvement of architect Edwin H. Brown, who both helped write BH1 and ran the Architects Small House Service Bureau, which designed homes that fit the ideals of better homes. These two factors would impact the landscape of the American domestic life and residential architecture into the modern day. And now, please welcome Noah Mowers as he presents Codifying Domesticity, the story of the recommended minimum requirements for small dwelling construction of 1923, the housing policy of the Hoover Secretariat, and the impact on American residential architecture. Noah?
Good evening. Thank you, John, for that wonderful introduction. I actually kind of should apologize whenever I was asked to submit what's your speech going to be about, what's your lecture going to be about. I gave them sort of just the basic rundown and overview of what I was going to talk about tonight, not realizing that I had written their introduction. So we've gotten the baby version of the lecture now. So got a nice kind of ease into it. So again, thank you, John, for that wonderful introduction. And I would also like to extend my thanks to you, the Society of Architectural Historians, as well as the St. Louis Public Library. When I started my research on this, it was the summer of 2023, not 1923, and I actually started this as like an archival project to try and, I was working with the Association of Preservation Technology, if you're familiar with their work. They work out of or one of their chapters works out of the National Building Arts Center over in SAH. And the main aspect of my project was basically tracking down all of the legacy building codes throughout the United States. And while I wasn't introduced to tonight's main character, what's so great about this library is their commitment to making knowledge accessible. And whenever I had come into the Science and Technology wing, I actually spoke to a librarian, and I was like, hi, I'm here to try and figure out, what historical building codes that you guys have, and her face lit up. And she looks at me and she goes, I've been waiting for you my entire life. And I was like, oh. She's like, a few months ago, organized an entire shelf on the floor of the Science and Technology wing devoted entirely to all of the building codes that we have on file. And I was like, that's amazing. You just made my job like way easier. And in fact, actually, when I was going through and tracking down collections of building code outside of the University of Illinois, St. Louis Public Library actually has a massive library of our legacy building codes. And so in my sort of spreadsheet of tracking everything down, they were incredibly, they were, like ranked number 2 or number 3 in terms of biggest collection. So a special thank you to St. Louis Public Library, both for that and also just for their commitment for well over a century of making knowledge publicly accessible to all. Tonight, I would like to tell you all a story. It has a complex cast of characters. There's war, intrigue, politics, and even architecture. If the Oscars are any indication, it has the making for an epic blockbuster film. In fact, much like The Brutalist, it too is about our perception of one of the greatest myths of the modern age, the American dream. However, this isn't about the struggle of one man to complete an entire project. Rather, it's about a nation coming to terms with itself following a gruesome war, pandemic, 2 major economic recessions, and a housing crisis. Stop me if any of this sounds familiar. Indeed, there are many parallels between the early 1920s and the early 2020s. To quote author and fellow Mississippi River rat, Mark Twain, history doesn't repeat itself, but it often rhymes. And it's for this reason that when I stumbled upon one of our main characters tonight, I felt it worth making it my goal for about a year to research and tell its story. Now, I know what you're thinking. I'm here to listen to a lecture on a Tuesday evening about building code. Sounds like the perfect recipe for a snooze fest. And hopefully, by the end of tonight, your perspective on that will change. I'd like you to meet the recommended minimum requirements for small dwelling construction. It's a bit of a mouthful, I know. For the rest of the evening, we'll refer to it primarily by its Department of Commerce code, BH1, and that's B as in boy, not V, like the music video channel. When I first stumbled upon this code in Washington University's Law Library in 2023, 100 years after its publication, I was only armed with one fact. It is the first of only a few building codes published by the federal government. In fact, they've only published 6, this being the first one. And I was immediately struck by this. Why would the feds be concerned about regulating specifically single and double family housing? We know, of course, that following World War II, it became the prerogative of the federal government to endorse and kind of push forward through planning efforts the suburban life that we've kind of come to know as like the American life. However, here we are, 1923, just over 20 years before that period, writing a code for exactly that same type of building. Unfortunately for me, my initial question to this is answered on the first few pages. These are the letters of submittal and acceptance of the building code. This is what you write to the head of your department whenever you're ready to publish a final draft of a code. Both the sender and receiver make it very clear. The purpose of this code will result in more economical forms of construction. Now, this I also thought was interesting. In most of your building technology courses in school, and indeed in my very first week of architectural school, we were given the old adage that building code is written in blood, i.e. typically a building code comes as a result as either public health concerns, life safety concerns, after tragedy. Triangle Shirtwaist Factory is a perfect example of this, when something will prompt the necessity to write a building code. And even this goes so far back as the very first building code, the Code of Hammurabi, wherein if a builder's house kills someone's son, the builder's son also gets put to death. Yet in this case, we have the economy playing a role, which I thought was very interesting from a perspective of developing a code. The second thing that struck me is this. We have hundreds of trade groups and individuals giving input on how this code should be put together. Now, this is nothing necessarily out of the ordinary, especially like today with the International Code Council, who writes our current building code, the International Building Code. Typically, you'll have trade groups, you'll have business groups kind of give their input on how it should be written. However, what's interesting about this is that's not typically espoused upon in code. This is something that's very interesting in terms of like how this is all being structured and made very clear that we're going through. So I also thought that that was interesting. And as I told Mike Jackson, who is the head of the Building Technology Heritage Library, I would like names, please. And I would like to know who is giving their input on this code. And the last thing that struck me about this is who exactly is writing these letters. The author of the submittal is Ira H. Wolson, who is the chairman of this building code committee, and later, as I'd find out through archival research, a lover of Spanish folk music. Now, who is he writing this to? He's writing this actually to someone that a lot of us will find familiar, Herbert Hoover, who would go on to become president of the United States, but at this point is the newly appointed Secretary of Commerce. And so I'm sitting here going, all right, we have a future president writing a building code about houses. This is one of the most interesting things I've ever heard of. Granted, I'm a researcher of building code, so like what I find interesting is like snooze fest for a lot of people. But it was something that I immediately caught on to, and when I was giving my final sort of presentation to APT about the direction of my research where I'd like to take it, I pointed to this and I was like, this is, I think, has something very interesting behind it. So following that, I came up with a very simple thesis statement on how to structure, really kind of looking at building code. In terms of code history, it's not really something that is done very often or really done at all. I met, in terms of people who are into building code history, Mike Jackson, Mel Green, who wrote a wonderful text on the history of green energy code. And apart from those two people, there really wasn't a whole lot in that. So I kind of had to forge my own path. And so I basically started off with a very simple thesis statement. The social and economic conditions of a given time affect the regulation of construction and thus affect the architecture. And in this case, we have the socioeconomic conditions of post-World War I America and how that rebuilding would affect the architecture. I was extremely confident in how easy this would be. I thought, well, we have a simple three-step process. Give an overview of the historical conditions of a time, analyze the building code, see if there's any cross-relevancy, and then even go out and survey a few buildings. But as I sort of started researching this and started going down the paper trail that is BH1, things got a lot more complicated really quickly, and they also got a lot more interesting. And so We started off with this flow chart here, relatively three-step process as well. We sort of end up with something more like this in terms of the dynamics of kind of what steps came into event and how the code was emerging. Now, there's two wings in here that we're going to talk about. This is a two-pronged approach of the housing policy of the Department of Commerce throughout the 1920s. One is the approach to building code, which is over here in red. And the other one is over here is an organization called Better Homes of America. And basically, the Department of Commerce married these two organizations together to create their housing policy. And so I saw my thesis basically change by the end of writing it to the housing policy of the Hoover Secretariat codified both American residential construction and domestic culture. Or the line I would jokingly give my friends, Herbert Hoover invented the modern concept of the American dream in 1923. So, how did we get here? Well, our story begins actually in Sarajevo, Serbia. Not in the United States, I know, but the assassination of the Archduke Franz Ferdinand in Europe meant catastrophe for Europe, at least for the years 1914 to 1917. We, of course, were not in the war. Now, for us, this meant an explosion in economic output. Actually, right before the war in 1913, we were technically within a recession. However, by 1917, we had seen an explosion in exports from anything from food to arms to materials to Europe go from $1.5 billion to $4 billion. And this continued following the American entry into the war. We saw unemployment drop from 7.9% down to 1.4%, which of course saw employment increase from 41.5 million to 44 million. Now, how was all this facilitated? Government intervention in the economy. The progressive Wilson administration created three large administrations to basically manage the economy during the war years. The War Industries Board, the Fuel Administration, and the Food Administration. And these basically brought together any interested parties or necessary parties in the manufacturing of arms, food, fuel, basically ensuring that prices would stay down, output would go out, we wouldn't have anything that would disrupt anything, say like labor strikes, occur in order to stem off the war effort. And what this meant is Wilson also needed, of course, a workforce to meet this. And he used a newly created department, the Department of Labor, to promote and incentivize movement from kind of more agrarian areas of the country, such as the South and the Midwest, to the Northeast. And this kind of is a major catalyst for what we now know as the Great Migration, which was when, and specifically in this period, 500,000 black workers moved from the South to the North to help with the war effort. And this is actually also when we were first introduced to one of the other main characters of this evening, Herbert Hoover. Hoover, at the time of the war's outbreak, was actually working as a mining engineer in London, and suddenly he found himself stranded. And so he founded an organization to first help get Americans to the United States. And then that sort of evolved more into him starting another organization to get aid into Belgium called the Committee for the Relief of Belgium. And his Hoover biographer, Kenneth White, called this organization a pirate organization of benevolence, which now means that in my mind, I permanently have this idea of Herbert Hoover wearing a pirate's hat, which is incredibly funny to me. And the reason why he called it a pirate organization is because Hoover had to organize between the Allied powers, the Central powers, and the neutral United States in order to ensure that grain, food was able to get to Europe. So, we have a government moving workers rapidly from one side of the continent to the other. We have massive booming in industries and industrial output. Begs the question, where are all these workers going to live? And the answer is that there really wasn't a place for them to live. Housing was in a shortage state as early as 1914, and reported by journalist Curtis Hitchcock in the Journal of Political Economy, there wasn't anywhere for them to go. All housing at this point was left up to private speculation. This is due to the kind of the return on investment that you get from from rents that you can then charge on the working class. Furthermore, the geographic concentration of the Northeast contributed to this issue. You have a lot of people moving to one place, and there's, of course, not enough housing for them. Hitchcock wrote in 1919, workmen were drifting into towns like Bridgeport, Bethlehem, and Sparrows Point, attracted by the money, working for a few days, and then unable to find living quarters, drifting away. And what housing that was available was objectively terrible. According to the editorial staff of the Journal of American Institute of Architects, beds were worked 3 shifts, several beds were crowded into a room, men lived in tents, and cooked their food in holes in the earth. Another comment on this was from Frederick Law Olmsted, who noted that increased and fervent appeals to patriotism brought many high-skilled and self-respecting workers to these jobs. These men, usually married men with families, found conditions so intolerable that they would soon throw up their jobs and shift, hoping to find jobs under less outrageous living conditions. Now, with people moving, taking a job for a few days, and then leaving, this had a catastrophic effect on American war industries, resulting in a 200 and 300% loss in efficiency and an overall output diminished by 30 to 50%. So not only were people suffering, so was the war effort. And since, of course, the Wilson administration had already taken control of the economy, they figured, well, why don't we step into the housing game as well? This first came under the auspices of the Emergency Fleet Corporation, which was actually not founded originally to build housing. It was actually founded to merely make sure that ships were being built. However, when they noticed that a lot of their shipyards would see a rotation of workers, high turnover, they noted that we needed housing for this. Therefore, the EFC created the Division of Housing and Passenger Transportation, which was given to them by the government. And this gave them sweeping powers, including rent control, seizure of private property, and the ability to, if there wasn't housing, create housing. The efforts would also be followed up by another more focused government corporation, the United States Housing Corporation, which was founded in July of 1918. And they set out the ambitious goal of building 83 subdivisions in industrial communities, housing a total of 150,000 people. Now, 2 factors of these initiatives stand out. First, this is the first time in history that we see the United States government stepping into the role of housing. And secondly, it's interesting because a lot of the people that they employed were the who's who of the Garden City at that moment. Such members of the U.S. Housing Corporation, for example, included Frederick Law Olmsted Jr., Clarence Stein, and Henry Wright. And in a way, a lot of their projects were kind of used as a means to experiment with the Garden City movement. For any of you who aren't familiar with the Garden City movement, basically, as industrialization took over American cities, this contributed to a lot of pollution. And so the Garden City movement was sort of a reaction to this and was desiring to kind of decentralize the city a little bit, have people move out into smaller communities that were less dense, and integrate more green space into the urban fabric of the United States. And that was definitely part of the goals as well of the United States Housing Corporation and their Garden City members. Here we have actually one of their proposed projects, and this place has a very special place in my heart because it's actually my hometown of Alton, Illinois, the Milton Hill development. And you can see here, if we compare kind of this diagram here of what their ideal version of a city, and they're not actually saying that you build everything in circles, it's a diagram, sort of a diagram of showing how everything would be connected. But even still, you can see how everything kind of stems out from this central core and sort of radiates out into the rest of the community. And the community itself would feature athletic fields, ponds, forested areas, and large boulevards. It also kind of bears a somewhat resemblance to like Paris and also like DC, which of course have, after housemanization, they would go through and bulldoze, but they would build more green spaces in these large green boulevards. And unfortunately, this community was not built. However, there was a successful community built in Camden, New Jersey with the Yorkshire Village development. This one, of course, also incorporates a lot of the elements that we've seen before with a large central square with boulevards radiating out, connecting to different smaller gradually less dense residences. And it's still here today. You can actually still go out there. Unfortunately, though, a bit of it's been bulldozed and a parking lot has been put up. And we can also see this in a lot of the architecture. And one of the other things about the Garden City movement is that they were more fans of more traditional forms of American architecture. And we see this both here and later on in our story, kind of this harkening back to colonial architecture. Both as a means of its kind of, you can build it fairly in a more economic fashion, but it also has a nicer aesthetic value for the community as well. You can see here that we have a typical plan. The house that the U.S. Housing Corporation basically pushed forward was a residency that was no deeper than 2 rooms. And this allowed for better ventilation throughout the space, better access of sunlight into a space. And a lot of these communities, including their townhouses and their even their apartment buildings, were only built sort of to these 2-room depths. So of course, in 1918, in November, is the end of the war, only 5 months after the United States Housing Corporation's founding. Both the EFC and the USHC lived relatively short lives. As soon as the armistice was signed, their projects were put onto a temporary halt. And for the next month or so, Congress basically fought to shut them down. Among many of the reasons was their perceived expense. The U.S. Housing Corporation expenditure in its 5-month-long life of $194 million, while the EFC worked on an appropriation of $75 million. They were also symbolic of a growing threat to the status quo. Critics of these programs and other wartime measures, such as like the Fuel Administration and the War Industries Boards, refer to them as ancient, socialistic, and un-American. Of course, the programs were not without their defenders. Take, for example, Luctus D. Litchfield, who was the architect of Yorkshire Village, criticism encountered with these workmen's towns are a God-given opportunity for combating Bolshevism. How can a man be discontented when his government is mobilizing the best talent in the country to provide for his comfort? Woodrow Wilson even stepped in, of course defending his own policies, and commented, "It would seem a distinct loss to allow the sale of these properties without imposing such restrictions and safeguards as will preserve the ideal industrial living conditions that we have to establish." All the same, all of these criticisms taken into account, Congress halted the work, and this would be the end of any true federal housing effort until the 1930s and the Great Depression. Now, just because we ended federal housing, this doesn't mean that the housing crisis was over. Far from it, in fact. Due to World War I and the shift to economic output for ships, guns, food, and fuel, the housing market completely and totally collapsed. Between 1909 and 1916, for example, we saw an average addition of housing units as around 426,000. However, in 1917, we saw that drop to 240,000. And by 1918, that number in itself was halved to 118,000. Now, we do see a rebound occurring in 1919 with 315,000 units built nationally. However, this is a drop in the bucket for a lot of metropolitan areas. New York City, for example, had a shortage of 100,000 units at the same time, a third of the national yearly average. To compound this, the economy also entered 2 recessions. One short one in 1919, set off by the Spanish flu epidemic, which saw a 20% drop in industrial output. And then this was also followed up by a much more severe recession in 1920 and 1921, set on by a strained labor market, inflation, and reactionary rate hikes in the Federal Reserve to counter that inflation. It was actually kind of scary. So I'm sitting here in grad school. I'm reading a report published by the Federal Reserve Bank of St. Louis about precisely this period of history. And at the end they go, you know, this bears a lot of similarities to what we're seeing now in the American economy. Hopefully our Federal Reserve does the right thing and gets everything on the right track. Otherwise, this is our fate. I'm thinking here going, oh joy, I'm graduating and working in the building industry in 3 months. Let's hope there's not another 2008. Now, there were a lot of local measures that were still set in place that kind of were echoing from the war. In New York City, for example, following a massive rent strike, the city had actually put in place rent control laws to cap off the amount of rent that could be charged. And while that didn't necessarily help with anything involving the housing stock, it did certainly help with the affordability. However, that also had its own critics, including this guy, William M. Calder, who is an architect, a builder, and a former Republican senator from Brooklyn. Calder made a lot of his money in his life off of building homes in Brooklyn. In fact, the Prospect Park neighborhood of Brooklyn at the time was nicknamed Calderville because he had built 700 units of housing there. A lot of them kind of followed this sort of, in fact, actually, if you think of New York brownstone, you might be thinking of a Calder townhouse. These are double family units that make up much of the urban fabric of Brooklyn. And he didn't like rent laws for a few reasons. He found that they've limited the ability to build from the private impact of the private perspective, i.e. the amount of money that you could gain back off of building is diminished. And also he was critical especially of like the US Housing Corporation and the EFC because, well, if the government is building, that means I can't build. And that's unfair to me. He is also notable in our story for several other reasons. In 1919, he helped create a federal program to access mortgage finances and a federal lending system. And at number 2, he chaired the Senate Committee on Reconstruction and Production. We'll call it the Calder Committee. Now, the goal of the Calder Committee was to find the causes of the housing shortages and the means to address the housing crisis. Between April of 1920 and March of 1921, hearings were held throughout the country. Following this, they published their concerns. And among the reasonings that they had found through their investigation, lack of credit directed at construction, fuel and transportation shortages brought on by either labor strikes, the diminished ability to produce due to the recessions, and then also several testimonials about the growing costs in the realm of construction. Also, much like fuel and rail, a tight labor market was contributing to this, and material shortages. However, Calder himself noted during the hearings that whenever a building code is modified or revised, there is a tendency to make the character of construction heavier. Calder mentions throughout all of the hearings that many people are saying that if we reduce the size of a masonry foundation wall from 8 inches to 8 inches from 12 inches, that there would be a massive savings, and structurally speaking, we would have roughly the same effect from it. Now, I've read through the 3 volumes of the hearings, and almost in every single case when he brings this up, he's like, many are saying this. He's the only one who's saying any of this. And so what I find interesting about that is then you do see this echo throughout journalism, building journalism from the 1920s up through the 1930s, because Chicago was very late to adopt any sort of measure like this. But oftentimes it was done in publications that were more targeted towards builders. It wasn't targeted from, say, publications that were funded more from like labor unions. So you kind of see this tit for tat battle between the developers, builders, architects, engineers even. And so among some of the accomplishments of this review, they also went through and took a look at the post-war British system of addressing their housing crisis. In Britain, following the war, they had actually continued their public housing projects, and that had played a very large role in their method of addressing it. And while the Calder report lauded their standardization and grouping of houses so that they may secure the maximum light and ventilation, they concluded that the government should not partake in housing construction unless no alternative exists. This was due to the belief that if the government were to interfere, the private sector would find housing a, quote, most undesirable investment. One of the people who meets in these meetings is Representative George H. Tinkham from Boston. And he proposed a bill in Congress at the same time called a Bureau of Housing and Living Conditions. And essentially what this bureau's job would be to act as a clearinghouse on matters of statistics, of the cost of basic materials, and the uniformity of building codes. This committee would be born directly out of the efforts from the United States Housing Corporation and the Emergency Fleet Corporation, i.e. a lot of the architectural work contributed to them from the Garden City movement would then make its way to the Bureau of Housing and Living Conditions, and then they would disseminate that to builders, designers, et cetera. Now, they looked at this, they go, wow, this is a great idea, but you want to put this into the Department of Labor, which we don't really want to give more attitudes to labor. And Tinkham was also kind of hopeful that this would, in fact, bring back the federal housing programs. He was a much more progressive Republican than, say, Calder. But under the recommendation of a different senator on the committee, Franklin T. Miller, this was moved to the National Bureau of Standards underneath the Department of Commerce, which means that our friend Herbert Hoover is back. Now, before we get into the Code and its committee, it's important that we talk about Herbert Hoover. Like I said, we've run into him in an earlier in the story. He's been a mining engineer, a grain pirate, food czar of the Food Administration. He's a man who likes to wear many hats. And now in 1920, we find him actually in two positions. One is the head of the American Relief Administration, and the other is Republican presidential candidate. However, during the Republican National Convention, and as well as the primary in his, air quotes, home state of California, he's actually from West Branch, Iowa, which is a little tiny town. It's very cute. You should go there. They have a nice library, where his national library actually is. But his perceived defeat in California, as well as performance in the Republican National Convention, led him to drop out and throw his support behind a more moderate candidate for that year, Warren G. Harding. Now, in return for this award, Harding gave Hoover the cabinet position of Secretary of Commerce. Now, up until Hoover's tenure, the Department of Commerce was pretty much a award seat. Basically, if you were put there, that's because you were an ally of whoever won the election, and that's all they did. They had many responsibilities, including overseeing fisheries and lighthouses. That is it. That is all they did at this point. And had a very small budget of roughly $17 million. Now, they also had the National Bureau of Standards, and within the National Bureau of Standards, that hosted a small laboratory that would basically run small tests on material science properties. And that's where they put what was called the Division of Building and Housing. And Hoover saw his position here as something much more lucrative and powerful. To quote Hoover himself, "I was interested in the job of reconstruction and development in front of us. That for the Department of Commerce to be of real service, I must have a voice in all economic policies of the administration." I stated to Harding that this would involve business, agriculture, labor, finance, foreign affairs, and as far as they related to these problems. I stated that if I accepted, I would make it clear that these departments were under my control from the very beginning. Now, how did he do this? In the words of historian Ellis Hawley, Hoover put himself at the center of bureaucratic empires to end future bureaucratic empires. To quote Oscar Wilde, and one of my favorite Oscar Wilde quotes, "The bureaucracy is expanding to meet the needs of the expanding bureaucracy." Effectively, Hoover organized all of these other departments to be in orbit of the Department of Commerce, earning him the nickname Secretary of Commerce and Undersecretary of all other departments. In establishing himself as the technocrat of the United States government, the Hooverite state sought to create balance between federal involvement in policy issues and giving power to more voluntary organizations, such as professional groups, trade unions, business groups, and industry leaders. This form of governing is called associationism. And a clear example of this is the blending of how Hoover uses sort of technocratic ideas and associational ideas in the way that his secretariat worked. Now, I'm calling it a secretariat, which has different connotations because of, say, like the Soviet style of government. Hoover was Secretary of Commerce from 1921 up until 1928, until he himself is elected president. This spanned sort of two presidencies, and to quote another historian friend of mine, Neil Flanagan, hi Neil, I hope you're watching, Hoover was basically president when President Coolidge was depressed. Now, back to the Department of Housing and Building. The housing policy of the Hoover Secretariat is brought through the efforts of this division. This came as a result of the Calder Committee, of course, as we discussed before, and the committee's goal is to establish gathering and dissemination of information as to best help in the construction practices and methods in order to encourage standardization and improved building practices throughout the country. This organized the Building Code Committee on the 15th of May, 1921, including these 6 individuals. Ira H. Wilson, our fan of Spanish folk music above there. William K. Hatt, who would take over Wilson later on. He was an accomplished civil engineer and becomes second in command of the BCC. Edwin H. Brown, who is a relatively unknown architect. He's incredibly important. We'll get to him later. Just know that he designed small houses. We have Ernest J. Russell, who unfortunately I could not find a photo of. Ernest J. Russell actually is a very important architect here in St. Louis. He designed the Federal Reserve Building, the Carnahan Courthouse, among many other St. Louis landmarks. And then we have several other engineers, Rudolph Miller, Joseph Newland, Joseph Worcester, and Franklin Cartwright. Now, how did they develop this code? At the first meeting, the code's overall structure was sort of decided. It would be a compendium of a brief, simple minimum requirements. They had a short introduction basically stating their goals and intent. They then also had the sort of the minimum requirements, which is now what we would associate more towards as a building code. And they also had an appendix, which was a 70-page illustrated explanation basically of how they came to their conclusions within the building code. Chief among these recommendations was, of course, as we mentioned before, the reduction of walls from 8 inches to 12. They reviewed, to get to this point, they reviewed 314 building codes and tested brick walls at a laboratory in Pittsburgh, which had a 10,000-pound testing machine. They also put a lot of these into tests and would even go out and survey houses that had 8-inch walls to make sure that they were all working properly. And the appendix of this kind of goes through, as I mentioned before, all of the reasonings of how they put together the code. While not the code itself, the appendix does give an explanation of the reasons behind the code's intents. It also gives you very detailed drawings on how to build and how not to build. For example, it includes diagrams such as this. And the reason why they included a lot of these diagrams was one of the engineers on the committee, William Hatt, believed that the building code could not only ensure that there is safe construction, but it also could act as a manual for construction, i.e., I can give you this building code as someone who is a person building their own home ostensibly, and you yourself could use this as a means to figure out how to build your own home. So here we actually have an example of an approved detail for how to put balloon framing together. And here we have a lot of common mistakes, such as like the lack of cross bracing, sort of the ability to not have supports at the corners. Here we also have something that a lot of us in residential architecture are probably a lot more used to, platform construction. And a lot of these drawings, for me at least, one of the main things that I was just taken by was just how pretty they are and the fact that they're in a building code. Now, largely upon the code's publication in 1923, it was considered a success and well received by the construction industry. Within 6 weeks, the government printing office sold the first 8,000 copies and had to place an order for an additional 10,000. By July of 1928, 128 municipalities had adopted this code. It also received international adoption. In New Zealand, BH1 was used as the basis of their first national small timber building code. However, this code was not without its critics. As I mentioned earlier in the introduction, when you have sort of economic impacts on your building code, there might be winners and there might be losers. We actually have a very well-documented case of losers with the case of BH1. In my thesis, I titled the section of this, the West Coast Lumbermen's Association debacle. However, in private, I always refer to it as the Great Shingle Conspiracy. Now, how do we get to this? In paragraph 42 of the appendix, they very clearly state, as well as they state very early on in the report that they were not going to give any input on materials used in roofing in congested areas or really any area in the code. However, for the next 7 sections of that paragraph, the committee warns against the use of wooden shingles in congested areas, owing to their severe flammability. Now, it is worth noting, paragraph 6 there does give a nice kind of levity to what they're saying, which is light in weight, has excellent insulating value. Wooden shingles promote effects and have a high-grade shingles can be properly laid, produce a very nice durability and architectural effect. However, the rest of it is basically saying we do not recommend that you use these in areas. Consult the underwriter's laboratory for better materials. Please do not use this in congested areas. It will catch on fire, especially because of chimneys. Just please don't use it. This kind of upset a certain association involved with this, the West Coast Lumbermen's Association. They are a representative industrial body of different lumber manufacturers, i.e. they're a lobbying group. And they represented industrial interests that produced about 85% of the amount of wooden shingles in the country, which following sort of these outcries from several meetings of their own group, they then wrote to their representatives as well as the committee themselves and said, hi, please remove this or we're going to sue you. And this basically made its way through Congress, including Wesley L. Jones, who was a senator from Washington, and was also a member of the Appropriations Committee. And basically, he wrote to Hoover stating, yeah, if you don't cut this out, we're gonna cut your funding. It's not gonna be a good day for you and your whole program. And so then Hoover, who's now under pressure from his Republican allies in Congress, then writes to Ira Wilson to say, basically, he, quote, wished for immediate revision or suppression of the objectionable portions. Wilson disagreed back to him, stating, this would force an emasculation of portions of the committee's report for selfish reasons. The director of the Division of Building and Housing, John Grease, also echoed Wilson in a letter to Hoover. And basically, nothing really happens, at least at this stage. Now, it is worth noting in 1932, they actually published a second edition of this, and they remove any mention of wood shingles. Nothing about the flammability of the material. It is completely and totally removed from the code. And so, as step 1 of this, the Building Code Committee represents sort of more of the technical aspect of the approach to construction, i.e. this is how you need to build. We're also going to tell you how to build safely, and thus kind of putting more power into the hands of the builders, more power into the people who are actually going to be constructing their home. There is also, of course, this other part of this, which is talking about what type of architecture would be ideal for them to construct. And this is kind of more where we see the return of the Garden City movement into the conversation. At this point, there is a magazine called The Delineator, which is a conservative women's magazine. Hold on a second. Basically, their primary goal of journalism was to give consumer advice, some fictional columns, and a few other editorial pieces sprinkled into the mix. Better Homes actually gets it started off here in The Delineator as a monthly column called Better Towns. Basically, what Better Towns served was readers of the magazine would write in, say about what's happening in their towns, as sort of a means to talk about the positivity of community. They also had something more, I wouldn't necessarily call it the dark side. The Delineator just really, really liked traditional family values. One of their regular contributors to their writing, Irving Bacall, who was an early newspaper magazine, wrote several columns basically about the plight of American culture in the 1920s. One of them, called Turn of the Tide, called the city, quote, a crime against civilization and one of the greatest perils of our republic. And then he would go on and wax poetic about the idyllic paradise of the small town and saying that people should invest, quote, in the character of your children, the happiness of your life, and the immense advantage of posterity for this republic. Another Bacall original column, the 2 credits, celebrated 2 forms of credit, business credit and moral credit. And while he was writing that America was rich in business credit, the riches that have been produced by that credit produce a deeper poverty than that of our fathers. In many American homes, we need a reestablishment of moral credit, a task for the women, in which the church ought to be able to offer a strong and helpful hand. Now, while Bacallor did not contribute to the Better Towns column or the Better Homes campaign once it started taking off more formally, his work does drive the narrative of what kind of the delineator was trying to sell. America's families were in trouble, and if the family was failing, so was America. One of the key contributors of seeing the delineator as a role in the housing conversation was its editor, Mary M. Maloney. She is regarded by her own biographer as the most important woman you've never met. Up until this point, she was a journalist covering World War I, relief efforts. She is the first woman to first female journalist to sit in on a congressional hearing. So very important in the realms of women's history, especially within journalism. But she also saw that the role that the delineator could play, as well as what the role of the government could play. Maloney saw how the government could play this role and organized a model kitchen demonstration under this new organization that she founded, Better Homes in America, and invited President Harding out to see this demonstration. And President Harding loved the idea so much, she was like, you need to come talk to us in DC, and let's see if we can try and make this, give you a bigger platform. And so this is the beginning of how Better Homes gets kind of swallowed up by the Commerce Secretariat. And by 1923, it had become completely and totally integrated into the Division of Building and Housing, with its headquarters located at 1653 Pennsylvania Avenue in Washington, D.C., next door to the Blair House and right across the street from the White House. The president of the time, Harding and then Coolidge, would serve as sort of this figurehead of their administration. Herbert Hoover would sit on as their chairman of the association. And the National Advisory Committee also featured the Secretaries of Agriculture, Labor, and the Interior. And it also featured a Building Code Committee member, Edwin H. Brown. Now, as I mentioned before, Edwin H. Brown designed small houses, but he didn't exactly quite just do that. Brown was also the founder of a national organization known as the Architects Small Home Service Bureau. A nonprofit organization, this group would help create plan books for model homes to be brought by prospective homeowners. However, what set this group apart from a lot of its competitors is that its clients would often work with small home bureau affiliates, local architects, to take these plans and then sort of customize them to how they liked. A lot of their plans would range from 3 to 6 home houses, had a range of square footages from 800 to 2,200 square feet. And if we look at this and we think about the Garden City movement houses that we saw in the United States Housing Corporation, there's a lot of similarities. We see traditional styles, we see small footprints, lots of access to natural shade and light. And so the Small House Service Bureau, through Edwin H. Brown and his connection at the Bureau of, the Building Division at the Commerce Secretary, made sure that their plan book made its way into a lot of their Better Homes sort of publications. It is important to note that it wasn't directly part of Better Homes. However, the organization did publish this. This is their plan book of small homes. And this kind of gives a better idea of sort of the strong architectural connotation of how Brown's sort of vision of what his own ideal architecture, and thus Better Homes and the Secretariat, sort of contributes to American residential. Now, in terms of the amount of housing that they actually constructed, they built roughly 10,000 homes. However, a historian, I believe his name was Frank Martin, noted that while 10,000 of these homes were built, oftentimes their plans were then copied by other competitors. And so their kind of impact is quite widespread across the United States. One of the other ways that we can see sort of this idealized architecture coming out of Better Homes than demonstration homes. This, for example, is the Better Homes Center in Philadelphia. It was built for the Sesquicentennial Exposition, which, if you're like me, finding this out recently, it means 150 years. This is to celebrate the 150th anniversary of the founding of the United States. It was built in cooperation with the Girl Scouts of America, and it is actually uses historic materials, but also blends modern technologies such as HVAC systems and plumbing. The brick, of course, is a historic material, but the brick actually used on the chimney of this house was the cornerstone brick from the Hayfield Manor House, which was owned by George Washington. The kitchen was also central to its design. There's, of course, kind of this idea of this modern kitchen being central to modernizing the home and making labor easier on the housewife. Was another means of them to kind of say, this is the ideal home for the American people. Oftentimes, their architecture for their demonstration homes would also represent the vernacular, if sometimes problematic typologies here in the United States. This is the winner of third place for 1923 of their demonstration homes, and is a renovated slave cabin. This was a gift by philanthropist Grace Bigelow House, and was also part of another Better Homes endorsed programs called Boy Built Homes, which is basically a program to get students involved into the trades. In this case, it was built by a school of color in the South, and after it was built, became a laboratory for home economics for that same school. Better Homes also encouraged the idea in a lot of their publications to use boy-built homes as a means for home builders and homeowners to save on labor costs in their houses. Better Homes is also an important act to this addressment of housing crisis. However, it does a lot of retrospective journalism and research done on Better Homes it says that both the building code as well as the Better Homes Administration is basically taking this housing shortage and placing it onto the backs of the American people. However, they thought that this was a massive success. Quote, "The appalling anomaly of a nation as prosperous as ours, thwarted largely in its common yearning for better homes, is now given way to gratifying a revival of home construction. Accordingly, the time is ripe for this revival to afford an opportunity to our people to look at more homes, better ones, and to more economical and uniform building codes, and to the universal establishment and application of zoning rules that make for the development of better towns and cities." This program does actually, there are large numbers that are associated with this. 937,000 units were built in 1925, for example, so we see a massive explosion in housing construction. And Hoover is quoted as saying, "Well, I'm far from claiming that this was due to our various campaigns. They, however, helped." He also criticizes it in comparison to New Deal economics. However, it is worth noting, combined with the unemployment of that period of 24.9% and a homeless rate of 1.5%, the Roosevelt administration's housing program was less about pushing a certain type of housing and more getting people out of shanty towns into public housing. The work, however, of the Building Code Committee can still be felt today. Of their 6 codes, one of the most notable is BH8, which is their recommendations on arranging of building codes. And this arrangement was then used by the 3 regional building codes, Uniform Building Code, I'm blanking on it now, wow. The Southern Standard Building Code and the BOCA Code, which was primarily used in the United States. There we go, there's the 3. And these 3 model codes acted in sort of regionalities, and it still contributed to a lack of uniform building codes in the United States. But they did come together in the 1970s to write the Cabo Dwelling Code, which was much like BH1, a single and double family housing code to address also to help build single and double family housing in the 1970s and 80s. And they also came together in the 90s to form the International Code Council, which is the building code council of writes our building code today. And so while of course this history is one that is not necessarily well known of, I do believe that looking more at the history of building codes, and especially today with a lot of our current conversation on residential building code, especially in the realm of like the single stair, in order to understand how we get to those points, looking at the history of our building code is incredibly important to understanding how we can reform it. And that concludes my talk tonight. Thank you very much. Now, as I understand, we were going to open up the floor to Q&A. However, I understand that it is 7:38, so we have a few minutes, I think, for a short question and answer. So I will open up the ground to questions. Yes, please.
Are you aware of the St. Louis Association of Realtors' efforts to standardize building codes in the St. Louis area? And if so, what are your thoughts?
I'm actually not familiar with that, though I would like to actually talk to you about that after the talk. I personally, when you're looking at it from like a national level, I see a lot of, on one hand, there's a greater thing for uniformity, of course, in terms of like standardization of building materials. Having a standard building code across the country and even regions can be beneficial. However, when we look at like even like the 3 model codes, we're looking at different like weather variations. Like Southern Standard Building Code was looking more at hurricanes, whereas uniform would look more at seismic conditions on the West Coast. So I would say that I am largely in favor of trying to get it as fairly standard, but it does need to take into account like local, maybe even like say local industries to avoid having to ship materials across the country. If we can find ways, maybe not indoors, because then of course you're playing favoritism and then you piss off people who are making shingles, right? But I would say that an effort to standardize building codes in the St. Louis region would be net beneficial, especially from a standardization effort. Yes?
I'm a historian of technology, so I'm coming from a different angle.
Sure.
And this is a period with such dramatic change in domestic technology and areas where electrification, piped water were all available. But if they're trying to spread this out nationally, there are a lot of areas where those aren't available. The kitchen is changing, the electric stove is coming in, icebox to refrigerator.
Sure.
How did they deal with being in the middle of a rapid changes in technology of the home?
Well, I think whenever they were primarily looking at this, they were less on the technical aspects of the actual appliances that they were putting in there. They're definitely more into it on the social aspects. One of the things about Melanie is that while writing for a conservative magazine, she was also a feminist, and so she saw these, of course, as means to save labors for women working in the house. And so I think that in a lot of ways, the way that they were more looking at it was more from the social aspect. Now, I would say that, like, later on when we're looking at this, say, like post-World War II, and say you have General Electric who's going from airplanes and they need to shift, there's also sort of this industrial incentive to say, well, we need to shift into something that's going to be better in peacetime. So appliances would come into that as well. Yeah.
But several of your examples had second floor bathrooms, which it means that either you're in the city with piped water, or you've got an electric well pump.
Yes, this is coming, so if we take a look at even say, let's take a look at Yorkshire. So a bit of a backstory on Yorkshire. It was actually quite expensive to build. And they're taking a greenfield site and they are transforming it, but they are also including things like plumbing. One of the things that kind of shocks me is like the timeline of this and the ability for them to get that infrastructure out to these sites. And the fact that they were, putting this out there, that it was doing this. Now, what you do also see in the case of like what you're more getting at, which is I think the inclusion of indoor plumbing in a lot of urban conditions, is in the 1920s, as you point out, that wasn't really the case in a lot of places. In fact, where the Arch Grounds is located today, a large reason as to why it was being emptied out was because in a lot of those buildings, there was a lack of plumbing. And so whenever people were moving away and out into more homes, they featured these modern amenities, which also drove kind of this idea of leaving the city for something that, you know, for lack of a better term, for greener pastures. And it's sort of, I would say that because of that, you know, that also helped. It was kind of a reaction to the urban condition and seeing this new technology in these homes. There's a quote actually from an Italian immigrant, and I'm gonna have to paraphrase, but basically she had visited and she had lived within a city and gone to one of these demonstration homes, and she was like, this is the only way to live. And so I think a lot of people in this period, and especially in the period following World War II as well, were kind of seeing this revolution in technology as like, wow, great. So they left the city, which wasn't able to adapt as quickly, and that also contributed to the suburbanization of a lot of American cities.
Yeah, I was a little confused about this, the Better Homes in America with their headquarters there in Washington, D.C. Were they like what you would call an NGO, or what was their?
Yes, so they started off, right, so they originally started off as an organization that was independent underneath the delineator, but following 1922 and 1923, they were folded right into, they kind of were an NGO, but they were very closely affiliated with the Division of Building and Housing. On their board, if we actually go back to, get these guys back up. If we're looking back at the organization, if we look at the list of people that are present in terms of their leadership, Herbert Hoover, of course, director of the Secretary of Commerce. We also have John Grease. John Grease was the head of the Division of Building and Housing. Edwin H. Brown is also on there, and I believe there is also a couple other members of our Division of Building and Housing on there. So it was sort of married into the Commerce Secretary, but it also interacted as a means to be sort of independent, but it was part of the Division of Building and Housing through its leadership. Yes?
Yeah, considering the modular construction and factory-built homes, and with today's need, what have we learned?
Sorry, could you repeat that last part?
I say, what did we learn? How far have we come?
I mean, if you're looking at modular construction today, we see, especially in prefabrication, kind of a revolution that's currently going on. I mean, at this point, we also have 3D printing. We have, you know, so many other means of prefabricating and mass producing building components for housing. Actually, which I think as a technology historian would be something fascinating for you to look at as well, would be sort of this revolution that we're having right now in 3D printing, especially from the perspective of kind of labor and the quandaries it kind of poses to the labor movement currently. But we've kind of come a long way from this period of modularity, which was maybe more of like the Sears house, which would come on a box cart, and more to, I mean, the entire walls being able to be come in and craned into place, where you could have a house or even an entire building built within, you know, sort of a day. Does that answer your question, or was there something more that you were getting at? Oh. Yes?
Yeah, I'm surprised that there are so few, that most of these people are men. I would have expected more involvement from women, particularly since women had achieved some victories of sort, particularly with the amendment against prohibition.
Right.
And kind of the social feminist strain that would have been more involvement. Because it sounds like, although there was a housing shortage, it was part of the impetus was, I imagine, to
Yeah, and you'd be absolutely right in saying that. There's kind of this pattern that is seen both on a much more smaller scale with World War I because of the more shorter duration compared to World War II. But in both cases, you see great strides taken in women's rights and women's independence during the wars because obviously the men are away fighting. And women are then brought into the factories, they're then working jobs, and they go, hey, wait a minute, this is both periods sort of see this period of revolution and then sort of this counter-revolution that occurs during peacetime and a sort of return to normalcy. In terms of like the leadership that's in this, you're absolutely right. Most of the people involved, I mean, I think you can even take a look at the list of leaderships for Better Homes in America, for example. Most of them are men. And so, which is why I also think that like Mary M. Maloney is such a fascinating character in all of this. Because, I mean, of course, she's the founder of Better Homes. She's the one really kind of pushing this narrative, both through her work with the Delineator and her affiliation with the Department of Commerce. And so you really don't, but other than, her and a few of the other sort of wealthier women, like say, for example, the donor who lent the house in St. Helena, South Carolina, there is a lack of women in this. And especially since women are ostensibly the people who are spending most of these times in these homes, you would think that they would certainly have more impact. But unfortunately, the times meant that they weren't really a big part of the decision making. Any more questions? Well, I think on that note, we'll go on ahead and close for the night. Thank you all for being a wonderful audience and for being here for both to hear me talk about building code and for my first lecture. So thank you very much. Hi. Thank you, thank you.
Thanks for coming tonight, everybody. We'll have another talk at the end of April. It'll be April 22nd, and Robert J. Moore Jr. will be giving a talk. It'll be called, If It Is Built, I Will Be Remembered. The First Women to Practice Architecture, 1436 to 1850. So I hope you can come back on April 22nd. Thanks, and drive safe, everyone.